Welcome to 1 Million Cent, the podcast where we equip you to share Jesus.
Hey, 1 million cent, 1 million cent. Get untrained and equipped 100%.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the 1 Million Cent podcast. My name is Ryan Fontenot, and today I'm joined with my co-hosts Dylan Chase, Zeke Garcia, and our goal at this podcast is to help you and us together train 1 million teens around the globe to share the gospel by 2030.
Absolutely. And one crucial part of that mission is seeing youth pastors from across the world train and equip their students. And today we are blessed to have the youth pastor from the Mount out in Keller, Texas, Joseph Hefner, with us today as our guest.
Yeah, Joseph, man, thanks so much for being here, man. Excited to get to hear some more from you. Tell us a little bit about how things are going at the Mount.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys for having me. This is a high honor just to get to be here. And so the fun part of this is Ryan actually helped hire me at the Mount. And so
that's true.
It's fun stuff. So, man,
Then bailed on you.
Yeah, bailed on me. Bigger things.
I paused because I did give him. I told him when he came.
He
during the
did,
interview
and like interview
process,
too. He was like,
That's awesome.
Just so you know.
just so you know, if you come, I'm not going to be here. He said, "Whew, then I'm
Wow.
coming."
Count me in. No, I'm at the Mount. I'm the student minister at the Mount. I've been there about 6 years now. My wife and I moved here from Denison, Texas. That's where we're both from. We're somewhat high school sweethearts, but there's some stuff in there that adds to that. Our son's due date is on Halloween, so
Hey, that's my birthday. It ain't Halloween, bro. It's Reformation Day.
That's right.
There we go.
That's right. So Martin Luther Jr. No,
It's already been taken.
man, we're super excited though. Just loving life, loving doing ministry. So.
Dude, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, man, let's do this. Let's go ahead and dive in. I know those that are listening and those that are watching, every time we get together and we talk, it's always cool to see what God has to teach us and show us through different people we're interviewing. And so, you've been doing youth ministry for a while now, and probably long enough to see the landscape change a little bit, with the rise of anxiety and depression, a lot of identity issues these days. We've made it through COVID, praise God. But that's brought on a whole set of new challenges and everything. So tell us, as a youth pastor, what are some of the biggest challenges that you are facing and that some of your co-laborers in ministry y'all talk about are facing?
Yeah. Whenever I was thinking on this, there's kind of three things that come to mind. One is a lack of awe for things or adoration for things. Two is lack of time. And then three is what you mentioned, just identity issues. So on the first one, lack of adoration for things, man, there's so many things that are pulling for the attention of students, be that social media or video games or extracurricular or teams or band or school or homework, whatever it may be. They've got all of these things that it's like, hey, this is a number one priority. This is a number one priority. This is a number one priority. And if everything is that number one priority, then nothing's actually a number one priority.
That's good.
And so, unfortunately, church and Jesus gets thrown into the mix of that. And instead of being the actual number one priority, like it's falling to the bottom of the list where it's like, man, instead of going to church on Wednesday night, like Wednesday night's my one free night where I can actually do homework. So I'm gonna skip out on that and I'm gonna do that instead. So that's one. Two, it kind of bleeds into that too, is just time. I mean, I just mentioned, like, you've got students that are just, I think they say that this generation is the most busy generation. Like they just have so much going on.
Yeah.
That they just trying to find time, like. And I have a student that I've been trying to take to lunch for weeks now, and it's just like, it's not happening because
you're a teenager.
I know.
How do you not
like,
have time?
You're 13 years old. What do you mean? We can't go get food together. So time, and then the third one, you mentioned it too, is just identity. And there's so much, I guess, confusion of just about identity. And again, I think a lot of that comes from what I said at the beginning of just, there's so many things pulling for the attention of students that they're finding their identity in different things, be that social media or be that football or school grades or whatever it may be, that they're getting lost in those things. And then when they, just fall short or whatever it may be in those areas, they're suddenly in this identity issue of like, well, that was my identity, but what am I now because I messed that up? And so you've just got students that are just searching for their identity in different things in different areas, and just leads to lostness. So
That's good. That's good. So
Yeah, I think with identity, you know, it's just this twofold thing of what's my purpose and what value do I have? Or maybe first you start with like, what value do I have? And man, if we could get these students to know that they're loved by God and that they have value and that their purpose is pretty simple. It's to know God, you know, and make him known. And that's been rock solid for what God has been communicating to us for, you know, thousands and thousands of years. So I see that as a huge issue. And then also, I think it's interesting you talk about how busy, you know, kids are. Or I think you said the first one was like lack of awe.
yeah, adoration.
Adoration, man. It's like, this is a tough generation. I've been doing student ministry for a while, and there was a time early on that the youth groups could provide like really fun activities or events, but I think these kids are hungry for something more. It's like that doesn't impress them anymore. They have access to so much on their phone and digitally that like even with what we do with music, it's like that doesn't have the same draw, you know, that it used to. Oh, we're gonna have an artist or a Christian rapper come. So I think it gets back to just discipleship and establishing that core identity. That's good.
Totally agree.
yeah, I think they may tie together, you know, the busyness and the lack of awe, because I was reminded when you were talking just in Psalms where he says, be still and know that I'm God. And if we're not still and they don't practice stillness or quietness, every minute it feels like is filled with something with ear pods in and, you know, AirPods and all this stuff. There's always noise and there's never just this stillness.
Yeah.
And so we kind of lose our awe of who God is.
Totally agree. And that's exactly what, so like on Wednesday nights this semester, that's our focus right now, is like we're taking a semester just to teach students what it means to be with Jesus. Like, what does it look like to just slow down, not go to Jesus? Well, like typically when we go to Jesus, it's like we have an agenda and we're like, hey, could you answer these prayers? Like, this is what I want. Whereas we're trying to just teach them like, hey, what does it look like to just be still and be with the Lord? Like, be in relationship with him.
Yeah, having said that, like I know those are challenges, but what are you seeing that excites you about this next generation?
So it's actually kind of the counter to what we just talked about. Like, because there's this lack of awe, man, if you can get students excited about Jesus. So at the Mount, we I guess define worship as our response to who God is and what God has done for us in Christ. And so it's like, man, if we can be big on teaching them, hey, this is who God is, this is what he's done for you, then you naturally see students like it catches their attention. I think because, like we've been saying, like because there's so many things pulling for their attention, like whenever you've got the sovereign God of the universe that's above all of these things and way more impressive than all of these things, and you start pointing them towards that, they're like, oh, wait a minute, there's something different here.
Yeah.
Like it catches their attention. And so I think like with camps and D-Nows and just student ministries in general, like if you can show them who Christ is, like, you know, you don't need all the fluff. You like just show them who Jesus is.
Yeah.
And they get so impressed with that. And that's where you get the students that are just on fire for the Lord.
Yeah.
And then they can start to see like, okay, how does Jesus fit into my school or my athletics or my extracurriculars? Like instead of it just being mixed in, it's like, no, Jesus is the main thing. How does that flow into all these other things?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think there's real opportunity there just to point students to Jesus.
That's good.
No,
That's
I love
good.
that, man. And one of the things that working in student ministry that I see as well is, like you said, you have all of these struggles that you see among students, but I do see a hunger within this next generation right now of like, man, we've been doing the same thing for so long. We've watched the generation before us follow these same things, and there's still an emptiness, right? There's this generation that's depressed and anxious. Like they realize what we're being fed isn't very accurate. It's not satisfying, but they don't have anything else to turn to. And that's where we get to come in with the gospel and say, hey man, this is ultimately what you've been looking for. All these things that you're trying to feed yourself to really fill that void in you is found in Christ. And so I love that we can see the need, be moved with compassion and love for these kids, and then step in with the gospel.
Yeah.
It's awesome, man.
Yeah, it's talking about the gospel, you know, and equipping teens. You know, I'm thinking about as a youth pastor, this is like prime time. It's a prime time for them to not only know Jesus, but to make Jesus known, as Dylan said a while ago. And I'm curious, as a youth pastor, in what ways are you finding that you're able to equip them and empower them and encourage them, your students, to actually share their faith in everyday life? I remember when I was a student pastor, man, some of the most powerful times that I had with my students was out sharing the gospel with people and equipping them and seeing the light bulb come on, like, I God can use me. I don't have to just bring them to my youth pastor and you lead them to Jesus. Yeah. So what are ways that you're finding that you're able to equip and encourage and empower your students to share the gospel?
Yeah, we actually use a strategy similar to what you guys use with the symbols. Zeke's repping it over there. So, so we give them a strategy. We give them like practice. So like, same with, if you're in a weight room, right? You do reps, you get stronger and stronger with those reps. So we give students reps of like, almost like speed dating setting of like, hey, you've got 5 minutes to share the gospel. You've got 5 minutes to share the gospel. Okay, switch seats and go again.
Good,
switch seats, go again. And so just getting them practice, because then, as you said earlier, right? Like practice makes what was
permanent.
it? Yeah, there it is. Practice makes permanent. So, and they get used to doing those things, and so once they get those reps in, they start to feel confident in it, and they've practiced it so that whenever that opportunity comes up with, a different student or a neighborhood person, somebody at their school, like that, they just get the opportunity to do that, and they're like, all right, I know what I'm going to say. I've practiced this. We also challenge students. We're big on challenging students just to see things as mission fields. Yeah. Right. Like, I remember whenever I was a student, it was like, hey, you have to be on mission. You got to go on a mission trip. Like, you got to go somewhere. You got to. That was the mission trip mindset. Yeah. But just challenging our students to kind of think differently on that. Of like, your school is a mission field that God has intentionally placed you in. Like, your football team is a mission field that God has intentionally placed you in, or your band hall, or your theater, or your neighborhood, your job, like whatever it may be. You are intentionally placed in those areas to make Jesus known. And so see that as a mission field and work through that and look for those opportunities to share Jesus with people.
That's good. That's good.
I think it would, this thought just came to me, for students. Maybe mission field sometimes, like maybe it feels so weighty or so heavy, and it is a mission. But I think from now on, I'm also going to tell students it's an opportunity field. You know what I mean? Like, more than just focusing on a mission, which is like, this is what I have to do. It's my mission. It's like, no, it's an opportunity to see people go from death to life, like darkness to the light. And I think like to get them to know that like their job is just to love Jesus and be faithful. The opportunity's there, but the Holy Spirit is going to be the difference maker,
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's, real switch of moving from, hey, I'm intimidated to sharing the gospel to, man, I'm excited about it. It's not this burden I have to accomplish. It's this blessing I kind of get to walk in, And so how do we help students like shift that mindset, from, man, this is a burden, it's something I have to do, to, man, I get to be part of this, How have you found that happen?
That's a great question. So just thinking through that mindset of like, because that can apply to anything whenever it comes to our relationship with Christ. Like, I have to worship Jesus versus I get to worship Jesus.
Got to go to church.
I have to go to church versus, man, I get to go to church. And so it's that same conversation, I guess, with multiple pieces. But where I would go to just kind of encourage other student ministers or encourage students that are kind of feeling that weight is starting to understand really the influence that you can have as you do that. And that's something we encourage our students with, like maybe sharing the gospel with someone, like walking up to a random teammate. Maybe that's something that feels really, really intimidating to a student, but like maybe a smaller step that you could take. I don't know, this might be bolder for some people than just a one-on-one conversation, is just telling your team like, hey, before practice today, like I'm going to take a moment and pray. If you want to pray with me, like come take a knee with me, just kind of giving them practical steps to where instead of it feeling like, okay, I got to do this, I have to have this conversation and like weirding them out about it, you just give them little steps. It's like, hey, if you start to just live out your faith in big and bold ways, and not even necessarily big and bold, that's probably not the right words, but like it can be small and little ways.
Which is big and bold to
right,
some.
Yeah, those small and little ways become big and bold to others.
That's right.
Like and that may be all it is. Like, you may have a person on the team that they have all these questions about Jesus, but they don't know who they can go to and talk to. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, my friend over here is leading a prayer, so maybe that's somebody I can ask these questions or get answers. And so you just don't know. Like, there's so many doors that can be opened. Like, I know the number one question, like if you go to a random student and you're like, hey, come join us for Wednesday night, come join us on Sunday morning. The number one question that you get back in response is like, well, who goes to that church? Like, who's at that place? Like, who's going to be there? And so that's what they want to know. And so I try and flip that back to students and go, like, who might be here because you're here? Like, who might be at this, like, who might join us? Who might come to know Jesus because of you and the influence that you have?
Yeah.
That's awesome. I love that, man. I love like the way you present that even to your students of setting up small goals for them. Like, all right, maybe you're not ready to share the gospel with someone completely, but what's one small step that you can begin to take? And then what's the next step and what's the next step? Continuing to push them in that. One of the things that I share with people is that some of the apathy that I think we see with people in the faith is because they're not sharing the gospel with people. It's like, man, I just feel so stagnant and dull. But when you share the gospel with someone and you see their heart and their eyes just enlightened by this truth to say yes to Jesus, man, it's one of the most affirming things of like, man, what I believe is real. Like, this actually changes people's lives. And so what's the experience you've seen within the lives of students when they take that step to share the gospel with someone? How does that begin to transform their life personally? And how do you see growth in them?
Yeah. So, relevant story. So this last summer, actually, we did middle school camp and high school camp, and we took a senior with us to, he'll know if he listening to this, what I'm talking about. We took a senior with us to middle school camp, and he was a leader for us, like pouring into those middle schoolers. And so that got him excited enough, like just to be the leader for the week, like pouring into those middle schoolers. But then the next week was like, we did back-to-back weeks. And so the next week he was student, right? Like, he wasn't leader, he was the student camp, but he brought one of his good friends with him. And so on one of the nights, it was Chad Post preaching. And so Chad gave an invitation and the student stood up, like the friend stood up. And so he came over to me and we started talking, and like, we're on our way out the door, and I don't know what else to call it other than like a Holy Spirit moment. Was like, hey, grab him, like grab his friend. And so I went back and I grabbed his friend. And so the guy that he brought with him to camp was now receiving salvation. And I actually got to grab the student that invited him in the first place and be like, hey, you come lead this conversation. Like, you did it last week with middle schoolers. Now you do it. And like, the excitement that stirred inside of him was so cool. Like, that's awesome. So like you said, Zeke, like you just see it become real, like, to students. They start to understand, like, man, this isn't just, a piece of the puzzle. This isn't just a part of things. This is real. Like, there's eternities at stake. And I think that once they start to see that salvation click and start to happen, like, they're like, okay, I need to be doing this with these other friends. I need to be praying for these other friends and tell these other people about Jesus. Like, it kind of sets that little fire. Yeah.
I love, like, even in communicating, a helpful reminder for me, like with students, is the power is not in you and how you communicate. The power is in the gospel message. Yeah. And when you can trust in the power of that and just say, man, I just got to be faithful and obedient with what God has called me to share. Yeah. You see the work happen. It's like, man, God just used me. Like, I can't do anything significant. Like, I'm nobody, but yet he uses us because there is power in that gospel message to transform lives. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
That's what you see this, and it's almost like when the light bulb comes on in one student, it comes on another. Like, he led his friend to Jesus. It's almost like, I can do that too then, you know what I mean? So it becomes this deal where it really does create this culture, of evangelism, again, where they're not like, oh, I got to bring them to Joseph on Wednesday night to lead them to Jesus. Hey, I can lead my friend to Jesus here in the locker room or at the lunch table, or at the coffee shop. I can be part of this, and God can use me. And so, there's a lot of youth pastors who will listen to this, and when they listen and they're listening to it, they're trying to think of, man, how do I create this culture of evangelism? Kind of a phrase I like to use is how do I move that needle of evangelism in my youth ministry? I wonder, man, if you have any advice for any youth pastor or leader or even pastor out there going, man, I want to see our people do that. Where they're leading people to Jesus, they're out there doing it. They're not just say come Sunday and hopefully they hear the gospel and respond yes, but how can we help people, or how can we help move that needle of evangelism in our youth ministries?
Yeah, man, understand, like, yes, your students are students, right? Like, they're going to have bonehead moments and things like that. But at the same time, and they are capable of so much, so much. Like, some of them are taking calculus, and man, that alone is just insane to think about. So they can get this theology stuff. Yeah. Like, they can grab it, they can know it, they can understand it, they can learn it. And so I'd say be equipping your students, but also, and like, don't underestimate students. And I mean that on a general level, but also a specific level. Like, I know a lot of student ministries have lead teams and like leadership and things like that specific students are a part of. And I'm for that. I think that has a purpose. But also, whenever we do that, we can tend to overlook other students that it's like, man, they may have this great gift of being able to just talk to people. Yeah. But because they're not on our leadership team or whatever it may be, we're like, I need to turn to one of these students instead. And so, man, yeah, on a general level, don't underestimate your students, but also a specific level, like have like our go-to, if we have a brand new student walk in the door, is I'm going to go grab whatever student is closest to me and introduce that's their age, gender appropriate and everything else. Like, I'm going to go grab the closest student to me and just be like, hey, this is a new student. Hey, would you mind showing them around, make sure they get to their right room and things like that. And then that's an instant connection, an instant opportunity for a student that might not necessarily be a leader, but you've put them in a leader position and they're like, okay, I can do this. I can introduce them to that. Mm-hmm. And so it just kind of builds that culture. Like Zeke said earlier, like it gives them little attainable goals where they start to be like, oh, I did help get them connected. I did become friends with them. And it just builds that confidence within the culture of like all of your students are capable of leading.
Yeah. I always tell people it's not one thing, it's everything. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Every little step, every little bit matters. The welcome, the handshake. Hey, let me show you here. All of it matters. That's great advice.
That's good. Yeah. And what are some ways that you've seen the culture of the student ministry at the Mount? Because you've been there for 6 years.
Yeah, going on 6 years.
Mm-hmm. So that's like even right before COVID, huh? Mm-hmm. And now you're dealing with this like next generation that's up and coming, and how do you guys create that environment where you have older students passing it down to the next students?
Yeah, we do that in a number of ways. One of the most intentional ways that we do it is we actually have something called Student Sunday. And so we do that twice a month where instead of like just sticking with their age group, we actually have our older students. We have adults that sit with them. Our adult volunteers kind of are there as like a crutch if they need it kind of thing. But they actually lead the conversation. So our older students get the opportunity to interact with our younger students, and it kind of helps build those bridges and those relationships. So that's one of the most practical ways we jump in and do that.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's great, man. And I love the intentionality with you and your church of not just looking at a few individuals, but how do we get everyone involved? And when you can get your whole student ministry to take ownership of that, man, it can really just change not just the culture of your church, but your community.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, that's good. Man, all this stuff's been helpful. That's why I love these conversations, because there's so many little practical things. And as people are listening, maybe they're picking up on this one thing here. Something resonates with a parent listening here. And, kind of as we begin to wrap up here today, I wonder, think right now in your mind of maybe a parent that's in your ministry. Don't call them by name now, but think about like a parent and someone listening there who's maybe struggling, or they're just trying to see their kid not just get on fire for Jesus, but also begin to walk this thing out. Growing and going. And what's maybe some encouragement you would give a parent if they're like, hey, I'm just not sure my kid's getting it and they're not living this out at home? Like, what's a piece of advice that you can maybe give a parent of encouragement as we kind of land this plane today?
Yeah, man, students are sponges, right? So they're going to replicate what they're seeing being done. And so for that parent that's feeling discouraged and they're not sure that, man, I don't know if my student's getting it, I'm not really sure, and be praying for them for one. I mean, that's foremost, be praying for your student. Two, be living it out yourself. You know, like, man, if you're used to doing your Bible study like behind a closed door or something, maybe go do it at the kitchen table, like where your student sees you doing that. Yeah. Because at the very least, they may walk by and think like, hey, what do they read? Like, what's my parent reading right now? And ask about that. Yeah. And that's an instant opportunity for you to share, hey, well, I'm reading in John right now, or whatever it may be. And this is what I'm learning right now. Make sure that you have open avenues of communication. Like, if you're picking them up from church, I mean, I know it's cheesy to be like, hey, what'd you learn at school today? But like, and maybe it's, hey, what was talked about today? Yeah. Like, what was one big thing that stuck out that you could teach me from tonight? Like, try and put that ball in the student's court, and that'll give you opportunity to really see, you know, where they're at, because they may be more excited about it than you think. They just aren't showing you. So
yeah, that's good. So you would say, hey, number one, make sure you're praying for them, which is awesome. Number two, practice it in front of them, and then keep those communication lines open. I think, man, that's just solid stuff there. So I love it.
That's good, man. Joseph, just thank you for being on the podcast, and honestly, thank you for what you're doing in students' lives. I mean, a lot of us here with Rage, we get to come in for one night or for a week and partner, and this just excites me to partner with churches like the Mount to know that we could just be that extra push to a much bigger picture that's already, you know, in process of being developed. So thank you so much, man, for being on the show, and genuinely thank you for what you do investing in students.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for the huge impact y'all make. So it's awesome.
Blessing. It's a blessing.
Yeah, and to our listeners, man, if you can just leave with one key nugget, I think it'd be what Joseph was saying is, what's that one small step for you? All of us are part of helping advance this gospel, reaching the next generation. So what is that one step for you as a youth pastor to start developing that culture of that? Or if you're a student watching, what's that one step that you can take to be bold in proclaiming this good news? But let's continue to work together to help reach this next generation.
Yeah, everybody. Hey, thanks for tuning in today. I hope you were encouraged. And if you were, I want to encourage you right now to share this out with somebody on your social media. Hey, text it to a friend. You never know if you will simply hit that send button or that share button, who's going to be impacted by that. A small little thing goes a very big way. And so thank you for tuning in. And remember, follow us on all the social medias. And don't forget, as I always love to say, today is a great day to tell somebody about Jesus.